Um, Gucci. Word. Well, what's up, everybody? I hope everybody's doing well and in good spirits. Basically, today I wanted to touch on a couple of interesting kind of topics related to what we've been talking about in class. So I need to mute this. So big things that we've been talking about last class, we got really into the conversation about Git and GitHub, and we're going to continue that conversation. But also today, I want to kind of jump more formally into the conversation about React and how we're going to be working with React in general. So last class, if you were kind of following along with what I was doing live, I ended up creating a new repository called Components that was just meant to show us kind of more about the process of connecting our React project from our local terminal to a GitHub repo. So that was exactly what we talked about last time. We just kind of create React app, a new React project, and we kind of got started with some of the files that were in here. A couple videos ago, I kind of broke down what's going on inside of these files a little bit more specifically. So like, what is the package.json? What's the README? What is the .gitignore? And some of the files in the source and public folders as well. Today, we'll talk about some of those again as kind of a recap, but we're gonna focus more on the conversation today about components. Like, what are React components? How do we use them? What are the value propositions, I guess, of a React component? What are they meant to do for us? And also, how can we use React components to enhance our projects and like things that we're working on within the React ecosystem. So the more that we start working with within React, the more that we're going to end up having to learn about how do we kind of do things that we want to do with React in general. So that is in essence what we're going to be talking about today. So the majority of time I wanted to spend first off is to talk about how we use React in the context of building our own kind of custom components and working with things that we want to build in the front end. So good news is I actually wrote a pretty decent README, kind of started a pretty decent README on this GitHub repo. So if you go to my GitHub profile, which is github.com/camunity, and you go to my repo called Components, you'll actually find this this repo that has a couple of different resources that we'll talk about today, including this README that has a lot of what I'm going to talk about today already written out so that y'all can read through it a little bit more at your own pace and get some more familiarity with what's going on with the components and stuff. Today, I'll kind of walk through it live, but the goal will be for you to kind of like follow along. Oops, so I'm gonna have to fix some of these links, but follow along with what's going on inside of the README, and you can you'll walk through some of the code that I'm talking about and kind of understand a little bit more of what I mean when we talk about working with different components. So toward the end of the last class, I kind of jumped into talking about components a little bit more specifically, and it was like kind of really rushed toward the end where I was mentioning like, oh, let's just create another React component and we add it to our app.js. Today, we're going to go through that process a lot more slowly and just make sure that we're all on the same page as to like how React works and how we're going to enhance our experience with it as we kind of start building out more apps on our own that require a lot more kind of complexity when it comes to the when it comes to kind of like building out these bigger web apps that we want to build. So cool. So basically what I want to start us back on is just going through the process of understanding what's happening in like a React project in general, right? Like if I were to open up like a VS Code window of like this React project that we're looking at here, right? It kind of looks something like this. We have a pretty standard kind of file structure for all Create React app projects that is the same no matter what, so long as you're using the Create React app toolchain to start your project, right? The only difference that you might notice is that you have, instead of this yarn.lock file, you have a package-lock.json, package-lock file.json. And that's just a different file for a node package manager. I have yarn installed on my computer, so that's why I have this yarn.lock. But everything else should be kind of similar for you as it is for me in terms of the overall file structure here. So when you go through your files, you're going to see all of these apps if the Create React app toolchain starts up the right way. And yeah, so briefly, last class, we kind of started talking a lot more about kind of just what's going on within like our components. But we talked about them pretty briefly, but it was more in the context of talking about Git and GitHub a little bit. So if you finished homework 1 or you finished that first assignment that I gave out, my whole ask of y'all was to spend time working on these projects on your own, right? And like make some changes to your app.js, just like our React app asked us to do when we started up. It says, hey, edit the source /app.js to see some changes on the local server. And so in essence, that's the same thing that we do whenever we're working on a larger project. Is we're going to use this app.js, which is the main kind of component that returns to that renders on our screen, and we're going to make changes to that file that's going to allow us to see our React app kind of in change over time. So one thing I'll do real quick to kind of just get us on the same page, I'm going to take this boilerplate app.js code. So this is the same code that kind of gets rendered when you do the regular Create React app installation, right? We have this kind of app functional component. I changed my app.js up a little bit earlier, so I'm just going to change it back real quick so that we can kind of start off at the same place and have this conversation a bit more nuanced. Let me actually do it this way. Cool. So what I'll do is I'll start the React local server. I'm gonna run yarn start. Technically, you can run npm start inside of this folder. It should start a script that's gonna start your server and open a new page in your web browser for keeping track of like what's going on within your React code base. So once that localhost server starts, we should see kind of the boilerplate code for the app.js that we normally see that tells us this thing about, oh, my fault. That's my bad. I think it's import logo from /logo svg. Okay, cool. So this is the like boilerplate like React.js like default app.js file that we see, right? And every time we run our kind of Create React app and start a new project and got to the point where we were we kind of got it up on a local server, we see the screen, right? And it says edit source /app.js and save to reload, right? And so we're going to be diving into more about what's going on in this part of the whole process and what's happening in this app.js file that makes kind of React interesting. So diving back to, so one thing I will do, since it also has this link here, is I'll open up the Learn React, click that Learn React link. It'll take us back to the docs, our holy grail of information. The reactjs.org website has so much information that's going to be really helpful as we kind of embark on this process. So I'm going to just open up the docs from clicking this link here at the top. And then on the right-hand menu where it says installation, getting started, et cetera, I'm going to click main concepts. And today we're going to be talking a little bit through these first couple of things, probably first 1 to 3-ish. And so the first thing is talking about how React kind of gets rendered on the DOM. And we're going to come back to this in a second about React rendering on what's called the React DOM. But before that, I want to kind of just dive back to what the application does in general, which is to edit the source app.js and save to reload. So let's just do that and go make a kind of superficial change to this. So instead of having this thing say edit source / app.js and save to reload, I might just do something like say like change this text that's inside of this paragraph to just say something a little bit more to what I'm doing right now. So let's get ready to rumble. I don't know where that's from. Learn React. I guess I should say also. We're here to learn React. Cool. So I just edited this app.js, like I said, saved this. The server kind of did something. It kind of looked like it reloaded or something. But then I come back to the app.js and I can see that change is already reflected there. And that's one of the cool things about working with a Create React App toolchain is this development server that they launched for us on localhost 3000, which lets it be the case that whenever we run that npm start or React or yarn start to like compile our server and whatnot, to compile our code and run our server, we can see these changes have changed in real time. So if I change this from a paragraph element to maybe like a header element, or a heading element, excuse me, we'll see some other stuff change about it, right? So now this text is just a little bit different because it's no longer a paragraph, for instance. So yeah, clearly, if we start making changes in here, if I delete this image, right, and go back, some of these things are going to change real quick and make it so that the overall page is going to be responsive to what we're trying to change inside of this code base. So what's really going on here? What is this function app thing, and what's going on inside of here, and what's this export default stuff? Y'all probably have a lot of questions at this point because we've kind of just walked through files and didn't really have a lot of, we didn't really kind of dive into this as much. And so today we're going to do that. And essentially we're going to start off by asking ourselves, well, what does this look like, right? If I close this up for you, right? This looks like any old JavaScript function, right? It looks like a kind of a plain JavaScript function. And that's exactly what it is. This is just literal a JavaScript function that is defining something, it's returning something, and it's declaring something, right? In the world of programming, we create functions. Different programming languages have different syntaxes, but we already talked about how JavaScript functions, we use this function keyword, we name the function, and then inside of the function, we do some operations, and then we end up returning something. Well, if I close this return statement for you, right, it looks like we are returning something. Very simple. It's like this div that has a lot of different elements inside of it. And again, we've been talking about this pretty consistently. This stuff going on inside of here is also JavaScript. It's what we call JSX, which is a syntax for writing React elements that's written in JavaScript, but then gets converted into actual HTML code through the process of rendering it on what's called the React DOM, which is essentially this interface that sits between our JavaScript code and the actual browser that we see here on kind of localhost 3000. So the React DOM is responsible for taking these elements that we're defining in JavaScript and turning them into things that are practical for HTML. So if I were to open this, like inspect this page, you'll see what I mean when I say HTML, right? So inside of the HTML file that we're looking at on this web page, we see typical HTML structure. Got this doc type HTML to declare that this is a HTML document. We have the HTML tag, which defines kind of the entire document. We have the head and the body. The ultimately kind of like we talked about with regular HTML, the stuff we see is inside of the body. So if I open up this body, I see a couple different scripts in there. But one of the things that's the most interesting is all of this that we're seeing on the screen is turned into this regular HTML. We have this div with the ID root, we have this div with the app, and we have this header. If I open up the header, oh, well, there's our H3. Let's get ready to rumble and learn React. So clearly what's happening here is some of the code that we've been writing here, right? It's turning into the code that we see visibly on the web page. And that's exactly what the React DOM is responsible for. It's taking all of this JSX that we're writing here, and let's say like all this code and stuff we're writing here gets transformed into the code that we see in our HTML document here. And the process by which that's happening is very interesting, but also something that I really want y'all to understand now. All of the code that we're seeing in these JavaScript functions, remember, we're looking at a JavaScript file right now, app.js. This is not an HTML file. This is a JavaScript file. That JavaScript file is doing some interesting JavaScript things, imports, exports, which we'll talk about. But also, really, the key of this JavaScript file is clearly this function is getting defined. And this function that's getting defined and declared here it has the name app, which coincidentally, or maybe not, has the same name as what we see exported here. And inside of this function, we're returning some code, right? And you might look at this code and you might be like, div, right? Oh, I've seen divs before. That's HTML. Or H3, like that's HTML also. Or anchors, that's also HTML. But at the end of the day, in the JavaScript context, and for what we're talking about for React, anytime you're working with a JavaScript file and you're returning elements like this, especially after creating a React app, we're not writing HTML here. We're actually writing JSX. So if you hover over these elements inside any kind of JavaScript React project file, you'll see that it says, hey, we think you're creating JSX and using the intrinsic elements that come with JSX within the JSX framework from React, and you're using the div intrinsic element, which is essentially a long-winded way of saying, hey, we have something that represents a div in HTML, but it's JSX. So you can write it within this JavaScript file. And that's exactly what we're looking at here, is a whole lot of information that is written in JavaScript in this JSX syntax that then gets transformed, again, like I was saying earlier, to the equivalent corresponding tags and elements that it would be in HTML. Now that's pretty cool, right? Because by way of using only JavaScript to do all of this, we get a lot of cool stuff out of the box. One of the things that we get out of the box is that we get to use JavaScript programming language features all throughout this file, right? So if I wanted to write another function, I could write another function, and that function could just be responsible for some logical stuff, right? But because this is JavaScript, I can tap into all of the richness of the programming language of JavaScript. So conditional logic and functionals and, all of the data types and data structures. Like I can make use of all of those in the same file that I'm now declaring all of the information that will also get translated to become my visual elements of my web page. So that's what makes React special. And everything that we're talking about here of like defining some kind of object, whether it's a function or another type of object that is basically responsible for returning this JSX, that is exactly what a component is in React. The component's job is to basically, how should I frame this in an easy to understand way? The component's job is to hold all of the code in JSX. Its job is really to define and return the JSX that is going to be rendered on our screen. And when I say rendered on our screen, I mean like show up here in our HTML. Like we use that word render a lot in React. And what we're talking about when we say render is what actually gets transformed from the JavaScript elements to the HTML elements on our screen visibly. That's what the rendering process is doing, is the React DOM is taking the components we defined and the elements that make up that component and actually putting it visible on the HTML that we're seeing on the browser. So again, simple way to understand what components are is a component is really just meant to define a set of JSX, return some JSX that's going to be rendered on the actual user's screen. I'll just plug my computer in. So here we see these elements, and these are the typical elements that we would expect to see if we were kind of just building this out, even in just like a regular kind of HTML-like experience. But again, the difference is that we're not working, whenever we're working with these JavaScript files and create React app, we're really working with JavaScript, which is really dope, but also I can understand might be super confusing at first. And you might be thinking, well, how do I know what I can do with this JavaScript? And what, like, yeah, how do I know what to then write? If all this is JavaScript, like, well, what's good? How do I kind of define new components? And I'm going to talk about all of that in today's class. Dope. So cool. So if that's making sense, just drop in the chat that, you know, this is kind of making sense so far. Or just throw a thumb up so I know that we're kind of in the same spot. Nice. Cool. All right, bet. So let's keep it pushing. And yeah, so clearly us making changes to this app.js and this app component is rendering different things on our browser when we kind of look at the actual code. So let's kind of dissect this file a little bit more to what's happening here. So when we're creating React components, there's kind of three things you got to be aware of how a component kind of does its job. The first thing is we need to declare the component somehow. So I would say step one, declare a component, right? And so there's actually two types of components, and we're going to talk about both types in this class. We're going to talk about what we call functional components, which I'll explain a bit, and we're going to talk about class-based components, which I'll also explain a little bit later. So the first step to any, whether it's a functional or a class-based component, is to declare that component. So what I mean by declaring it is like creating the, making sure that we are setting up like what that component is meant to represent. So I said declare here, maybe it's better to say define, like, so we're defining that component. And that's kind of what's going on in here, is us kind of setting up a component definition. Just like what we see here is like, this is just a typical function. So we're kind of defining what this function is going to return and all of the stuff inside of here, right? So let's think about it like that, definition versus declaration. First thing that to define anything, right? If we were defining a function, how do we do that? Well, we use this function keyword, and then we give the function some type of name that then we can call later, right? And so this function clearly has a name of app with a capital A. And inside of the function, then we're also defining what it's going to return. So what is what's happening inside of this function? And so that's actually step two. So step one was us saying, hey, we're going to make a new component called app. And we chose this first go around to create a functional component. A functional component in React is literally just what it means, like a component that's defined as a function. And so this function app is one way that you can define a component. And with a functional component, just like a regular function, it's responsible for returning something that is relevant to that function. In a React component like scenario, what the component is responsible for doing is returning some amount of JSX, and the JSX that's inside of this return statement is what ends up showing up visibly on our screen. So step one is to define the component. And we'll see the difference between defining a functional component and defining a class-based component in a second. The second step clearly is to return some JSX. And so the JSX, again, are these little elements that are that are designed to correspond to the regular, to like HTML that's going to end up getting rendered on our screen. So every element that you would expect to work with in HTML, I should say most of the elements that you would expect to work with within HTML are able to be reflected by a corresponding JSX intrinsic element. So you might want to use a div. Well, there's HTML div elements that have become that have become that have like a corresponding that have a corresponding JSX element to it. And the same is true to all of these other HTML elements that you might expect to use within any of your kind of web projects. So we have header components, we have header elements, clearly we have heading elements, anchor elements, all of these things that you would expect to use in an HTML-like context have been created for us as JSX by the React library. So one of the dope things about the React library is the fact that we can use these built-in elements, these built-in JSX elements that are corresponding to like various HTML that we would have had to write in regular HTML. But again, the point of the JSX is to allow us to write these things and still connect it to some JavaScript, which I think is pretty cool. So first step for a component is to define it, give it a name. And one other thing to mention about naming a component is we typically give our component some capital letter name. So here you see it's capital APP. Think of components like classes, and even like when we do write class-based components, we'll see syntax is similar. We keep a consistent capital letter for components that we're creating. This is unlike these actual JSX intrinsic elements that clearly have these lowercase letters and kind of work more similar to like the HTML equivalents that they have. So first step, define a component. Second step, have that component return to a degree some JSX. And then the third step is kind of an optional step depending on what is going on within what you would plan to do with the component. But the last step that you'll see often is exporting and I will say kind of similarly importing the component. So what we're seeing here is like this export defaults, these export default keywords, and in the same name for what we named our component is being utilized here. So we're saying, hey, export this default app. And the export keyword is a very specific JavaScript keyword that refers to the process of taking an object from a different file that you've written. Like say here, I defined a function. In JavaScript, functions are treated like objects. So the thing about objects are you can pass objects around, you know, change the value of them, things of that nature. One second. Okay. So yeah, so with objects, we are able to do a lot of interesting things data-wise, right? And so one of the things that is very typical in JavaScript is to define some object in a file and then export that object such that other files can make use of that object in another context. So here, what we're doing with this step is saying, hey, I'm going to export this app. You don't need to worry too much about the default keyword, but just know that it's important to add right now. But essentially what we're saying by this line is, hey, the same app component that I just created as a functional component, I want to export it so other people who are making reference to this file can find this module that I've created called app and use it within their own kind of context and whatnot. And so by doing that, right, we're now giving our component the ability to be utilized in other files. And that's exactly what's going on within kind of the Create React App default file structure. One of the things here is this app.js was already created for us. And another file that is also super important for kind of how the Create React App system is working with rendering these components is this index.js file. And we kind of talked about it real quick, maybe a couple of sessions ago, but
in essence, this index.js file is responsible for finally doing this React DOM.render function that is essentially a specific function called render that comes from the React DOM library that we import as default from our node modules that we kind of installed at the beginning. Remember when Create React App first runs, it by default installs a couple libraries for us, and it installs a couple libraries for us, and it also installs. It also sets up these basic files for us too. So one of the files it sets up is this index.js, and all of this is kind of what the default index.js looks like. It imports the React library, it imports this React DOM library, which are installed for us when the Create React App is running. It imports this index.css file, which I could just imagine you understand is just connecting this index.js to some corresponding index.css. That's exactly what it's doing. And then also importing the app from our app component, right? So this import statement is exactly, in order for this import statement to work, where we're bringing in something called app from this file /app, right? So the / means, hey, in this same file, that folder that I'm in, so I'm in this source folder right now. In this folder, there is a file called app, and I want to import something that was exported from that file, right? So if you go back to this app.js, that's exactly why this export is so important, because here we're saying, hey, if somebody's making reference to this file and wants to import something, what they'll be able to import is the same app component that I just defined here. And a good rule of thumb for best practices is to be consistent with the component that you're trying to export, naming that the same thing down here. You have to do that in order to have this export work. But then in the import, you want to be consistent and also name the import the same thing that you're trying to actually import from this particular file. There's some interesting things you can do with JavaScript where you could like rename this import if you wanted to, but for the sake of being readable and having your code be understood by folks, it's best practice to kind of just leave this import to be whatever the default export was named also. And again, like I was mentioning earlier, you can see that all of these instances have a capital A for the app that it's referring to, right? And that's because we're treating this as a custom component, something that we built. You can find a custom component. Normally, this custom components will have this kind of syntax where you're going to import some custom component from a specific file that you've created. And then I guess like a step 4, if you think about it in this sense, is using that component or rendering that component. So I'll actually add that here. I didn't necessarily add that to my docs earlier. Maybe I'll do that after this session. But step 4 would be like, actually rendering the component. So all components need to be rendered somewhere. So it's not enough to just return them, right? If they're not being rendered, they're not going to ever show up on the screen. And so when you look at the kind of Create React App docs for any of these first kind of main concepts, they're going to show you this React DOM.render function a whole lot. And you might be thinking, well, what is this function? We've never used it. And the reason why is because in the Create React, the reason why is because these guys at React and the Create React and the reactjs.org docs are not being restrictive on what specific ways you're using React and teaching you like a specific way of using React, right? We're clearly using the Create React App toolchain, which has a different setup than if somebody was to be just like kind of using React in a regular HTML file for themselves. So what they show us is kind of the overall concept of rendering something to the React DOM. And the React DOM is what really makes React, is the idea of this virtual JavaScript-based DOM that is intercepting calls from our React code and deciding what do I need to actually render on the screen at any given moment in time. You could think of the React DOM as kind of like a very smart, an enhanced version of the actual DOM that we were working with just our regular JavaScript a couple of sessions ago. And the valuable thing about the React DOM is that it can respond to like changes happening with React elements, which what they did this for was to optimize the experiences that happen with transforming the DOM, right? We talked about how JavaScript can manipulate the DOM using various JavaScript DOM manipulation functions like this one here, document.getElementById, uses JavaScript to search our HTML document for some element with this ID, right? So we can use JavaScript for all types of things that connect it to HTML and CSS and whatnot. But those operations are not the most efficient in terms of if we were trying to like kind of prioritize having a very kind of structured approach to making sure our web page is kind of making changes as fast and as user-friendly as possible. And so the React team built React to make sure that these operations like for DOM manipulation, like changing what's showing up on a web page at any given time, they wanted to make that more efficient and optimized. And so they created this thing called the React DOM, which is what we call a virtual DOM. And you can look this all up, like just kind of like if we wanted to look up more about like what the React DOM is doing, we could kind of just see it specifically inside of the docs, right? And so the React DOM is really kind of creating a interface between our code and the regular DOM, and it provides a couple of different functions for us to use in order to like interact with the code that will be eventually rendered on our browser. And the one function that we see from our index.js file is this React DOM.render function. And the render function, in essence, is taking the React element that we're trying to show on the screen, right? And remember, the React element or the React component is just a series of elements that we eventually want to turn into something that will be put into HTML, right? And so the React DOM render function is what actually takes our app component that has all these elements defined and essentially shows it up on the actual screen. So, you know, if I were to change this from being app, which, you know, that would be me just changing what the default kind of stuff is, and just instead of this div and just render this div that says hello, right? What you'll see is that if I go back to my React app and just refresh, right? My whole React app that we were just working with, the app.js, is no longer there, but I still see, and you can see a very small, this little div that says hello in the top left corner. So not the experience I really want, but I just want to prove the point that whatever gets rendered from this function on the index.js is what eventually shows up on our screen. The Create React App toolchain is meant to help us build out dynamic single page applications. And so technically us rendering our app component is what allows us to start making use of the kind of single page application flow for React. And so once I refresh, I can see go back to our React app as we kind of know it. So this app.js component is doing a lot in and of itself. It's defining a component for us as a functional component by the name of app. It's returning some JSX, which every single component has to return some JSX. That's just something you want to nail. We want to get nailed down right now. No matter if it's a functional component or a class-based component, the job of a component is to return some JSX that will eventually be rendered on our screen. So that was a step 2. And then the third step was, if we're going to make use of this component in other files, we have to export the component. So here we're exporting it, and then clearly in the index.js, which is a completely different file, we're rendering the component and actually rendering it on the DOM. So that is how kind of React components work and what they're useful for. And so toward the end of last class, I started kind of showing off us making changes to these files and then like saving them and pushing them to GitHub. And one of the things I did last was I ended up creating a new folder inside of this source folder. So you see the source folder. Inside that source folder, I created another folder called components. And I did that by just kind of right clicking on the source folder, and I clicked new folder and I named it components. And so this is a folder that was not created by Create React App. This was one I created the other day. And inside of that folder, right? So I right clicked on this folder and I clicked new file. And inside of that file, I created another file called hello with a capital H.js. And again, you could probably imagine from this kind of structure of a file structure, what's going on here. On the one hand, I am creating a new file. I gave it a capital letter. And so like I mentioned before, this is how we start off the process of defining a new custom component. So it's typical that we won't have all of our logic for our application in just one file, right? I could put as much inside of the app.js as I want, and it will show up on the screen, right? If I add more divs or I add some images, clearly that'll all show up in here. But over time, this gets super hard to understand what's happening in here, right? It's not easy to see like, oh, like, well, what really is this component returning or rendering? So what we do in general is when files are getting too long, and this is a very common, thing that we do in computer programming, right? Is when our files are getting too long, we start separating things out so that we have kind of this separation of concerns, but we also can make our files a lot more modular and able to be reused because they're not doing more than they're responsible for doing, right? And that's the same way that we approach React components. Is when we want to build out another component, typically we'll create a new file for that component, unless we want to store multiple components in one file, which sometimes we do if those components are related to each other, but not necessarily if it's not necessarily the case that we would do that all the time, because sometimes those files in and of themselves get hard to read. So to make a long story short, let's kind of just talk through like this new custom component that I created. So again, I just made a new folder called components, made a new file, named it hello.js. And then inside of this hello.js file, I started doing another functional component. So here's kind of a even simpler look at what a functional component can look like. And one of the reasons functional components are so popular in React is because of how easy it is to write them. Clearly, all you got to do is write the function keyword with the name of the component, and inside of the curly braces, you write a return statement and you can return some JSX. Remember, these are the same 3 steps that I talked about here. Define the component, give it a name, return some JSX that will be rendered on the screen, export, import components, export, import components, and then depending on where they need to go, where they need to be kind of rendered, we kind of bring them into the other file. So for the case of this hello.js, hello.js file, we're doing some of those same steps right here. So first step, again, define the function. So we're creating this function called hello. We're returning the JSX. We're exporting the same name of this component here. And now, because we exported this component, we can bring this component into our into another component. So maybe what I want to do now is, instead of the app.js showing all of this stuff or showing this heading here, I might do something more specifically. I might do something more specific to showing this custom component, like rendering that component specifically. So what I'll do is I'm just going to delete everything outside of this kind of typical kind of. So I have this div still in here, and I'm going to keep the header because the header has some styling that was already done by default. And what I'm going to do is, instead of returning those regular JSX elements, I'm going to import our custom component hello from the file that it's located in, which is /components, because it's in that components folder /hello. And so when you're importing something, you don't need to specifically say that it has a .js at the end. You can add it. It's just not necessary in JavaScript. It expects that it's a JavaScript file. So it might cut off the .js if you use the VS Code shortcut. Another thing to know is that in VS Code, if you import something that's not being used, it's gonna gray it out. So you can see that these things don't look like they're kind of full colored. They like lost some, they got like kind of became more transparent. That's because they're not being used. I don't have this logo being used anywhere. If I highlight over this, it'll say, hey, logo is declared, but its value is never read. So this is just something that's being made to be helpful. So you know, hey, this is never actually getting called. I don't actually need this logo because I just deleted that code that had the image and stuff. So I'm going to delete that. But I do want this hello component that I'm importing from this hello.js file to show up. And so what I'm going to do is inside of the return statement. So remember, the return statement is where we're actually returning the JSX we want to show on the screen. I'm going to open a new tag and with this name of this component. And so just like kind of how these, just how the default elements, intrinsic elements are kind of positioned here in the regular kind of app.js like syntax, right? We see like, okay, we have this div, we have this header, and like divs typically are nested. So we see this kind of nesting going on with this component. Headers are typically nested as well. So we kind of see that nesting going on. But the idea is the same, where we open up a tag and then we close the tag. React components that are being called, being rendered on the screen have a similar syntax for how they kind of get structured in JSX. We open a tag and then they're self-closing. So you use the name of the component that you defined. So clearly I defined this hello component. And like I told y'all, I've been pretty consistent with the name of the component, the export is the same, and then inside the import is the same from that specific file. And now I'm bringing in this component, I'm using this component to be rendered eventually through this app component here. So I bring in this component into another component. And so the hello component is self-closing, right? Because it doesn't, there's no like, this itself isn't really a container. A more advanced kind of conversation about React, we could talk about how we can use React to have our custom components be nested components like this. But for right now, what you should remember is that most components by default are single line closing components. So you would just call the component and then close it off in the same line with this like / here. What's going to become, basically, if you think about it, what's happening here is we're saying, hey, we're going to have this div, we're going to have this header, and then inside of the header, we're going to have whatever the hello component is rendering. And our hello component is rendering just this div right now that has some text inside of it. And so if I save this now and go back to our screen, you see now the screen re-rendered, and we have kind of, we hacking on React, which is coming from the hello component that I created earlier. So this is really how components work with React. We're able to define them in separate files. They follow a similar structure of definition / declaration, and then implementation of them, and then we're calling them in other components, right? So one thing I want to point out is this hello component, if we just left it in this file, it would never show up on the screen. There's nothing that renders this component on the screen. The only component getting rendered right now is the app component, right? I could, if I wanted to, import the hello component here, right? It's a import hello from /component /hello, right? And then instead of rendering the app, I could just render hello directly like this. But as you're gonna see, after I do that, we're gonna lose that styling that came from the app.js, but we still get our component in here, right? So if I were to go back to the hello.js and make some more changes, like maybe I wanna make this a couple lines long. So just extend this return statement, maybe add some more to this div, maybe let's add just like a H3, say, making a big change, right? Save this. I'm still gonna get that kind of cool kind of development server support from the React DOM that just re-renders things very easily for me to see without having to refresh the whole page. But clearly this component is now working nice, and it's showing up now because of the fact that somewhere it's getting rendered, right? But if we go back to that, just having the app in here, if we refresh now, we can see we still have that other component, hello, but we also have the app component that it's kind of becoming a part of. So what's interesting here is if we use this app component and we import and like render a component on the app component, clearly we know that the app component itself is going to get rendered, right? That's what the index.js is for. So we can build components on top of our app component, and those components are also going to get rendered on the screen as well. And so this is what makes a single page applications interesting, is that typically with a single page application, what you're going to end up doing is rendering one component, like an app component or something like that, right? And inside of that app component, you're going to build out a lot of different components that will be rendered, and each component might have their own bits of logic for how to show what they're meant to return visually on the screen. All of the components are going to do these same 4 things. They're going to define themselves. We're going to return some JSX, which kind of just says, hey, here's what I want to show up. And then they're going to export themselves so that they can be brought into a file like the app.js or brought into another component, custom component. But eventually, whatever component ends up saying, we're saying that we're going to render in the index.js, that's the component that's going to show up on the screen. It is typically the case that we're going to leave the index.js alone. We're not going to change this from saying app, but what we're going to do is build more logic into our app so that it shows the right components at the right time. And that's what makes this so interesting, that this is using JavaScript, because on top of just running this function, right, I could do all types of interesting JavaScript related things to make this more interesting and nuanced. Like maybe I run a loop, or maybe I'm running a if else kind of scenario, right? And all of those different programmatic things can make this return a little bit more smart. And it just so happens that with people's experiences on the browser, there's a lot of room for like conditional logic and for us to kind of build out more responsive things that are happening based on what the user is doing, or what the kind of overall what aspect of the application's lifecycle are we looking at, right? So if, again, like maybe we're building an application that involves like a user logging in, and clearly there's 2 distinct moments of time in those types of applications. There's the moment where a user's not logged in, and we might want to show something for that. And then there's the moment where a user is logged in, and we might want to show something for that. And that's where this JavaScript like syntax can be really helpful, right? Because within one component, right, instead of just returning just like this, we might be able to do some logic in this kind of this moment. Like we could do like a if else kind of block, right? And I could say if there's no user, but if I say if user is logged in, I can return some JSX that says something like you're logged in, right? Or else maybe I just return some JSX that says something like you're not logged in, right? So the idea is that with the JavaScript, and I would have to return this if I was doing this, but the idea here is like, I can make use of this JavaScript programming language to extend what I'm doing conditionally with all of this kind of basic knowledge of returning the JSX that is eventually going to be on the screen. You can imagine with HTML, there's no way I can do all of this, right? I'm gonna have to connect the HTML to JavaScript anyway if I want to have these kinds of features. But typically connecting HTML to JavaScript, the experience is not as easy to kind of manipulate, right? On my JavaScript file, I'm gonna have to use a whole lot of different DOM manipulation functions to get reference to the HTML and then change the HTML from the JavaScript. And I'm going to have to structure the HTML in the beginning and all of that, right? But with React, all of the visual elements are also being defined and and rendered from JavaScript functions. So we can very easily extend the visual components with the JavaScript that we would want to, react to different people's changes on our website or different moments of time within our website. So that's what makes React components so special, is that it allows us to do all of these things. Earlier, I mentioned that there's two types of components, right? And we've been looking at the functional component a lot. So the last thing I'm going to talk about real quick for today is just the different component that is that we can define, and it does the same kind of steps of defining, returning some JSX, exporting, and then being imported somewhere else. So I'm actually going to create another component. I'm going to create a new file in here, and the new file, I'm going to name it, let's say, I want to be unique, but I was gonna make it one name, but I was like, that's gonna just be a little confusing. So I'm gonna say, let's say message .js. So I'm gonna create another component called message.js. And what this component is gonna be is a slightly different variation of the component that we've seen here, which is a functional component. So when Create React App first started, it created this app.js component as a functional component, which is why I started talking about them first, is because we clearly can see it here. But this second component is an equally as used component, and it also has a couple things about it that make it a very interesting choice for when you're defining your components, determining which components you would, which style of component definition and declaration you would use. So in this second form of component declaration, we're going to need to first we're going to need to import the React library from the React files that were installed with Create React App. We're going to import React from React, which is a very typical kind of syntax you'll see in React files, is import the React library from React. We're going to do that so that we can create another type of component, which is called a class-based component. So for a class-based component, we import React from React, and then we say, so there's a couple ways to write this. I'm just going to write this in a way that I feel comfortable, and then I'm going to explain what's happening afterwards. So I'm going to say export default class message extends react.component. Open these curly braces, and then inside of here, I'm going to create a render function, and the render function is going to return a div that says this is a class-based component. And let's just talk about this this kind of component that we're seeing here. So this is a my VS Code condensed it a little bit easier for us to see, but this is a class-based React component. So we're making use of the React.component object that is another object that is defined as a default to our from our React library. And the React component is kind of like, you could think of, if you're used to working with classes and object-oriented programming, this is kind of like an object that our class is going to inherit. So there's a couple of properties that come within React components that get passed into this custom component that we're creating called message. But a couple things going on. Remember from earlier, I said there's a couple steps that happen within creating components. We define a component, return some JSX, and then we end up exporting the component. That's exactly what's happening within this class-based component, but it's happening even more condensed. We see this export default, right, which is the same thing that we saw at the bottom of this functional component, is this export default. but what we're exporting is defined here. It's this class called message. A class-based component does just that. It creates a class that holds the code that the component is eventually going to return and render. The difference between a class-based component and a functional component, one, let me just get rid of this this little conditional thing. The difference here is that within a functional component, all the function does is return the JSX. It's very simple. A class-based component has access to a couple of different functions that you can define for your component. So it actually gives you a little bit more, it gives you a lot more kind of support for defining your function, defining your components with out of the box, which is really cool. With functional components, they're meant to be lightweight. They're meant to kind of just be defined and then returned. There's ways you can extend them, but it goes into a little bit more, I would say a little bit more intermediate subject matter. Whereas if you learn how to write class-based components, not only are you going to learn all of the stuff that the functional components can do, but with a lot of extra library support, all of those same things are built into the class-based component. And the interesting thing about class-based components are that class-based components was the original way in which we were defining our components in React until the React team added support for us to use functional components to define these components that are doing less with regard to manipulating kind of I'm going to just say state and props of our component. So state and props are two terms that we're going to talk a lot about in the coming weeks. But essentially what you need to understand is like the functional components were created to just very easily let us define and return some function that's going to have some JSX as a component. Class-based components have a lot more tools inside of them because it's extending from this React.component class that has a good number of functions defined on it as well. So if I kind of take a look at this class component stuff, you see there's a lot of different functions and values and all types of stuff defined in this interface for the component. Yeah, so we end up making use of the React.component and creating a class. So one thing that might, right now all of this is being condensed. I could break it up a little bit more. So I could say, instead of just exporting from the same line, I could export default message at the bottom, kind of like I was doing before. But you can see that the syntax is kind of the same, right? So whereas with the functional component, we created an object as a function. In a class-based component, we're creating the object as a class. This class is called message, and that message is extending the React.component main class. And that particular class, every class-based component one of the biggest differences between a class-based component and a functional component is that a functional component is already a function. So it's expecting to return some JSX, as that's all the function has to do. A class-based component has functions defined already that end up returning the JSX. And so the render function is a specific function that is defined on React class components that is responsible for returning the JSX that this component is responsible for. This is one of many functions that are already defined inside of this class because we're inheriting some properties and values from a library, from the React library that were already predefined. If you really look at this, right, this render kind of open braces, return kind of thing is basically just a functional component, right? Like it's almost as if they said, hey, instead of making it so that you have to create a whole class and then use a render function, you can just write your own function that is returning some JSX, and then we'll let you render that on the screen as a component. The class-based component has this specific render function, which is returning the JSX that we want from the class. But again, what makes the class special is the use of a bunch of other methods and that are defined on the class. And we'll talk about some of them in a second. But one of them I guess before I jump into that, I did want to say that hopefully you see that this is basically the same thing as the functional component. It just has a little bit more of a involved process of defining it, right? So defining a class-based component, it doesn't necessarily take longer, but it has more kind of that we got to do, right? It's not as simple as just name of the function return. It's like, oh, we got to write class, and then we got to extend the React.component, and we got to make sure we export that, right? So it's kind of has a little bit more steps, but not too much more steps that make it harder to use a class-based component than a functional component, especially given some of the functions that are defined for us to use on class-based components. So before we kind of talk about those things, I'm going to just save this component one more time, and I'm going to just bring it into our app. Just like we brought in the hello component, I'm going to import the same object that we exported. So I'm going to import message from .components/message, right? And underneath the hello component, I'm just going to render the message, right? So this is our second custom component that we're going to bring into our app. The reason we want to add it to our app component is so that it eventually gets rendered on the screen through the app component. So everything that we add on the app, remember, is going to go, and all of this is going to get rendered, even if it's a custom component, right? So whether it's a custom functional component or a class-based component, as we will see, I'm going to save, and then we see this class-based component is rendered there. Nothing crazy different, right? Literally looks the same as the functional component. No, there's no way you would know unless you were looking at the files that this was a class-based component versus this was a functional component. So, there's a bunch of different moments where we might use class-based components versus functional components. And part of the reason why we might use class-based components is because, like I was mentioning, class-based components have a couple of different methods that are defined on it. All class-based components have to, I'm trying to make that look pretty. It'll make it look pretty when I save it, but all class-based components have to define this render function. So I'm just gonna write that here as a comment. Need to define a render method. The render method, all it has to do is to return some JSX. So yeah, that's the responsibility of this function render. Then let me just save this, and then the class-based components also have a couple other functions that we can make use of. We're going to talk a lot about all of them in subsequent sessions and stuff, but in essence, I'm just going to show you one of them that we can use. And so this is also something that will make sense if you've looked at classes before in any other programming language. But in the React landscape, for creating a class-based component, we can make use of a constructor function. And a constructor function, just like you would expect in another kind of class and object kind of programming paradigm, the constructor is a life cycle method that gets called first, right? Gets called first, I should say, when a component class is initializing, right? So one of the functions that we have access to is this constructor function. So inside of here, I'm not going to do anything crazy. I'm just going to write a console log so I can show you that we can make use of JavaScript functions in here. So I'm going to say console log, hey, I'm in the constructor, right? Save that. And then as this page reloads, oops. So one thing is, when you write a constructor, you have to make sure that you call the super function in the constructor, or you'll get this error here. So inside of the constructor, what I'm going to do is just call the super function. So this basically, the constructor gets called. Super basically says, take this component that I inherited from, and then call the constructor in that component. So it's saying, hey, you got to actually initialize that component also. So now that error goes away. But if I look at this in the console now, right, because I just added that console log, If I look in the console, I can see that there was a little error here. That was because I had already refreshed that, so that should have gone away. But you can see here this, hey, I'm in the constructor message got printed, right? So that was the exact message that I printed here. So in addition to this component rendering, I was able to actually run some JavaScript code that happened here. Maybe I'll, instead of the console log, I want an alert, and I'll say a constructor. All right. So when this component refreshes, cool, I get this nice alert from the browser that says, hey, we in the constructor. Clearly I couldn't spell. I tried my best, but I missed the T. Got to cross my T's and dot my I's and stuff. Yeah, so cool. What's really cool here is now we can make use of different JavaScript inside of this constructor function that will also happen to, because it's a part of this class, we can make use of whatever we start doing here with data inside of our render function as well. And so that's a lot about what we'll talk about as we kind of keep hacking into this creative space of using React components. If we go to the React docs, it's kind of just confirm what we're talking about here. So here they were talking about rendering elements in general, right? So remember, this is happening inside of our index.js file. But they're talking about how, if we go into introducing JSX, here they're talking about how JSX is JavaScript that can be, that is equivalent to like the visual elements we want to show on the screen, but it's JavaScript. So we can set it to a variable and use it as code, right? Like in programming. They make the same kind of references as I do, like, yo, like this isn't HTML. So don't think of this as HTML. Think of it as JavaScript that turns into HTML. And I think that'll help make it make a little bit more sense, because I know it can be a little bit confusing. But here they're talking about how JSX really is producing React elements. The React elements are what the React DOM eventually renders as HTML elements. And we use JSX to just make the process of writing those elements a lot easier for ourselves. You don't need to use JSX with React. You could just use regular JavaScript code, but it becomes a little bit more hard to understand, right? So here, I think they have some way for you to see. They have a way for you to see all of these examples without the JSX. But the idea is that JSX is meant to make our lives simple and just defining these elements as objects in JavaScript that we can use in different JavaScript files and functions and stuff. And yeah, so here they're talking about JSX and how you can use like JavaScript code within the JSX. And that's one of the things that makes it super unique. You can embed JavaScript inside of these different JSX elements. And that's something that you can't do in HTML, right? Is add JavaScript kind of code and syntax into the actual elements you're styling and working with and stuff like that. So here it talks a lot more about why JSX is important. So I would recommend you read through the docs before Wednesday and kind of when we do this next session and kind of learn a little bit more about why JSX is important. And here you can see this is it breaking down kind of what happens if you're using JSX and you're trying to render something on React, right? So here it's saying, hey, you created an element that has some JSX. It's a H1 intrinsic element with this text. And they're saying, hey, if you weren't going to use JSX, here's what it would look like, right? So kind of looks similar, but this definitely looks a lot harder to understand. Well, React.create element kind of makes sense. It says, hey, we're going to create an H1 element. It's going to have these kind of properties and some text or whatnot. So, you know, this kind of is a little harder to work with, but working with this, it kind of gives us a more visual way to understand what elements are we going to eventually render on our on the screen. And that's what the next section is about, rendering those elements. So if you read through this section, it's going to talk a lot about how in order to render an element on the DOM, there's different ways that we can use React to insert our elements into the DOM. And so again, if we look at this index.js file, we see this function React DOM.render, and it's rendering kind of a couple of React elements. The React strict mode stuff, you don't really need to worry about. It's just saying that we're going to run React in a very specific mode by default. But what you want to really care about is this component that we're rendering in general, is the app component, right? And then the second argument to this function after the comma is this document get element by ID root. So if we looked at this whole section about rendering an element into the DOM, it says, hey, like, let's say there's a div somewhere in your HTML file. We call this a root DOM node because everything inside of it will be managed by the React DOM. So then it says, normally with React, we usually use just one root DOM. And then what we would do is use that area that's going to be connected to the React DOM, and we would render elements inside of it, right? And rendering the elements would say, take whatever element we're trying to render and then create a reference to that specific root node that we want to insert the element into. So here we see document get element by ID root, the same thing that they're talking about here in the docs. But what this is connecting to, and we talked a little bit about it when we first went through these files, is inside of this public folder, we have an index.html file that serves as the template HTML file that we end up manipulating with the React DOM and JavaScript code that happens with the React DOM. So this is the HTML file that actually gets rendered on our screen. Inside of that file, we see a div that has this ID called root, but that's really it. There's nothing else in this. There's nothing else going on in this file outside of that. What's going on is that we create this div that's going to be our root node for our React DOM. So this is when we say a root node is like what they're talking about here, which is that the root node is essentially just a element in our HTML that's going to be managed by the React DOM, and by being managed by this React DOM, we're going to be inserting things, editing things, and creating elements inside of this div, right? So by looking back at the elements inside of this page, right, that same div ID root that was in this template. So this is the same HTML template, like you can see. If I were to open it back up here, right, all of this stuff is the same. This HTML file is a template. This HTML file is a template. This is the same HTML file that we're talking about. And that div ID root that starts off with nothing inside of it clearly gets a bunch of stuff inserted into it, right? Div class app header. Well, what is this? Oh, div class app. Interesting. I guess that's this, right? This div with the class name app that we created in our JSX. So clearly what we're doing is returning this JSX from the JavaScript side is getting inserted into this HTML using those React element rendering functions that come from the React DOM library. So what the React DOM allows us to do is set that root node, and then we get to manipulate that just using React, which is really cool, because what that means is that the React side of our code, the JavaScript side of our code, is able to make more changes in that root node than typically it would be doing on the regular DOM, because every time we updated something else on the main DOM, right? If I were to add more elements to this, I would typically have had to refresh this page to see those things. But because this is the React DOM is a little bit smarter, any change that I make to the regular React DOM can get shown up very easily because just using JavaScript. And so that's what makes it easy for us to see these elements change over time and render so quickly, and all of that with React. So this section of rendering elements is going to talk about that. And what makes the React DOM special is this statement right here. React will only update what's necessary. And this is a very simple statement that's expressing a lot of complex stuff that's going on, which we'll talk about more over time. But I would recommend that you all read this introducing JSX section of the docs and the rendering element section of the docs to kind of get a little bit more deeper into the context of what's going on inside of the Create React App toolchain files that we're looking at. And then lastly, we started talking about components. So you could go up to like section 4 here. Once it starts talking about props, you're going to be getting into stuff that we'll be talking about more on Wednesday. So here you'll see the sections on functional and class-based components. So they're going to talk about the same stuff that I was talking about, how you can create functions and create classes, and kind of talk about the differences between them, how things get rendered, and et cetera, et cetera. The only difference is that they're going to keep showing you this kind of React DOM.render thing, which is not relevant to us because we use the create React app toolchain. But just remember, this is what happens with our app. Our app is getting rendered, and then we would end up creating these other components and adding them into our existing component that's already going to get rendered. So our app is our kind of root node component that gets rendered, and then we can insert all of our custom components into the app.js that way. So remember, follow along to learn the concepts of what's going on with React. The create React app toolchain is very specific in how it goes about things, but at the end of the day, the basic knowledge is the same of what's going on inside of here. And so yeah, I would say for y'all before Wednesday, I would read up to section 4 of these main concepts. Again, if you go to my GitHub to the components folder, or the components repo, excuse me, you'll see some of a little bit of documentation on everything I was talking about before, like these different aspects of creating a component. I'm going to update it a little bit given some of the stuff I talked about today, but I did get a good amount of thoughts down on this earlier. So I'll probably make a few changes so you can look at it today or tomorrow and get some just more perspective on what we just talked about. I didn't get a chance to add the stuff about class-based components, so I'm gonna add that in a little bit. And then, yeah, and this will be a good resource for you as you're kind of thinking about components and starting to work with them in your own way. But yeah, that